The Galactic Empire's soldiers moved like shadows through the frozen landscape, their black armor reflecting the pale light of the distant sun. Their breath came in short bursts, hissing through the vents of their helmets as they approached the human settlement, if it could even be called that. A scattering of wooden structures, half buried in snowdrifts, clung to the landscape like remnants of a forgotten age. The wind howled through the valley, carrying with it the faint echoes of laughter, the quiet murmurs of a family inside. Commander Vecker raised a fist, signaling his team to halt. His visor displayed heat signatures within the largest building. 8 life forms, 2 adults, 5 children, and a smaller one, barely more than an ember against the cold. He exhaled sharply. This was the target. "Move in," he ordered. The squad advanced with precision, boots crunching against ice. The door splintered under the force of their entry, and suddenly the warmth of the cabin was swallowed by the cold. Gasps filled the air. A woman shielded her children, her hands trembling as she stepped forward. The man beside her, presumably her mate, reached for a weapon, too late. A soldier struck him across the face with the butt of his rifle, sending him sprawling to the floor. Vecker scanned the room, ignoring the pleas of the woman. His orders had been clear. They weren't here to negotiate. They were here for one thing. His gaze landed on the smallest figure, huddled in the corner, dark eyes locked onto him with an unsettling stillness. The child. No more than 10, maybe 11 cycles old. Too young to be a threat, yet important enough to warrant an extraction order straight from high command. His dossier had been thin, an orphan, raised by a colony of human survivors on this frozen wasteland of a planet. No official records of why he was important, only that he was. Vecker stepped forward, towering over the boy. The child did not flinch, did not cower like the others. That alone sent a sliver of unease through him. He ignored it. "You," he said, voice distorted by his helmet's modulator. "Come with us." The boy said nothing. He only looked at Vecker, unblinking. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. A soldier grabbed the boy by the arm. The moment their hands touched, the lights flickered. The wind outside surged, rattling the walls of the small home. Vecker felt something, an almost imperceptible shift in the air, like the space around them had compressed for just a second. Then it was gone. The soldier hesitated, fingers tightening around the child's wrist, then yanked him forward. The mother screamed, rushing forward, but another soldier restrained her. The boy was pulled through the doorway, snow swirling around his small frame. He did not struggle, did not cry out. He only turned his head, meeting his mother's eyes with something that almost resembled reassurance. Then the doors closed and he was gone. The transport ship hummed softly as it ascended, leaving the small settlement behind. Inside, the soldiers secured the child to a seat, restraints locking around his wrists and ankles. He did not resist. Vecker stood in front of him, studying his face. There was something unsettling about the boy's composure. Most prisoners, especially children, cried, begged, shouted. But this one, he simply watched. Vecker turned away, dismissing his thoughts. It didn't matter. The Empire had deemed the child significant, which meant he was valuable. Whether as a weapon or a weakness, Vecker didn't care. He followed orders. The ship's engines roared as they entered the upper atmosphere, the view outside shifting from white snowfields to the dark abyss of space. The fleet's command vessel loomed ahead, its massive form casting a shadow over the stars. The comms crackled. "Commander Vecker, proceed to holding bay. The prisoner is to be transferred immediately to secured confinement." Vecker acknowledged the order, his gaze drifting back to the child. For the first time, he found himself wondering if the Empire had made a mistake. The holding cell was silent, save for the faint hum of the ship's engines reverberating through the metal walls. The air was cold, sterile, thick with the artificial scent of recycled oxygen. Dim overhead lights cast a bluish glow over the chamber, illuminating the lone figure seated in the center of the room. The child sat motionless, wrists bound, ankles shackled to the floor. He did not struggle. He did not speak. He simply watched. Dr. Kale observed from the other side of the reinforced glass, fingers hovering over his datapad. He had spent years studying anomalies, biological, technological, even the rare unexplained phenomena that the Empire dismissed as superstition. But this child was unlike anything he had encountered before. There was no fear in him, no confusion or resistance. Only patience, as if he knew something the rest of them did not. Vitals? Kale asked without looking away. A nearby technician hesitated before answering. Baseline readings are inconsistent, sir. Kale's brow furrowed. Define inconsistent. His heart rate is too steady. There are no spikes in cortisol, no adrenaline surges. For a child in captivity, it's abnormal. And there's something else. The technician hesitated again. His neural activity is, well, it's fluctuating in ways we can't explain. At moments, it spikes beyond human capability, and then it stabilizes as if nothing happened. Kale tapped his fingers against the datapad. The preliminary scans had already hinted at something unusual, but this confirmed it. The Empire had taken this child for a reason, though no one had told him why. Only that he was important. A soft chime signaled the entrance of Commander Vecker. The soldier's presence was a stark contrast to the quiet hum of the laboratory, rigid, imposing, purposeful. His black armor gleamed under the overhead lights, the insignia of the Galactic Empire standing out against the dull metallic walls. He approached the observation glass, arms crossed. "He hasn't said a word," Vecker muttered. Kale didn't respond. He didn't expect the child to speak. Not in the way they wanted him to. Vecker turned to him. "What do you make of him?" Kale hesitated before answering. "He's waiting." "For what?" "That's what concerns me." Vecker exhaled sharply. "High Command wants answers. If this child is dangerous, we neutralize him before he becomes a problem." Kale glanced at him. "And if he's something else?" Vecker said nothing. He didn't have to. The Empire didn't deal in ambiguity. If something couldn't be controlled, it was eliminated. A flicker on the monitor drew Kale's attention back to the child. The energy readings around him had shifted, imperceptibly at first, then more pronounced. The lights overhead dimmed for half a second before stabilizing. A cold unease settled in Kale's gut. He tapped the intercom. "Activate the dampeners." A soft pulse vibrated through the room as invisible fields locked into place, designed to suppress any form of unauthorized energy output. The child blinked slowly, his gaze flickering toward the observation window. For the first time, he acknowledged their presence. Kale's breath hitched. The boy tilted his head, and for the briefest moment, the glass between them rippled, like the surface of a disturbed pond. It lasted no more than a fraction of a second, but Kale saw it. He knew Vecker had seen it too by the way the commander tensed. The alarms triggered before anyone could react. A warning klaxon blared through the facility, emergency lights flashing red. The dampening field fluctuated wildly, the control panels sparking with sudden bursts of static. Technicians scrambled to stabilize the system, but every screen displayed the same error. Power surge detected. Source unknown. Kale turned back to the observation window. The child was still seated, still restrained, but the air around him shimmered, vibrating with an energy that had no visible source. The glass warped again. Vecker drew his weapon. "Cut the power to his cell." A technician hesitated. "Sir, if we do that, now." The lights in the chamber flickered once, then went dark. Silence stretched through the room, broken only by the heavy static crackling through the speakers. The backup systems engaged, emergency lighting casting the cell in an eerie red glow. The boy was still there, still bound, still watching, and then the restraints snapped. Not with force, not with struggle. They simply ceased to exist, metal disintegrating into nothingness as if they had never been there at all. The child rose to his feet, his silhouette casting elongated shadows against the crimson-lit walls. The air inside the observation room turned heavy, charged with something unseen yet undeniable. Kale's throat tightened, an instinctive response to the sudden shift in reality. The child lifted his gaze. his dark eyes reflecting something vast, something ancient. The glass between them fractured. Not shattered, not broken, fractured, as if space itself was splitting apart. Kale took a step back. The alarms screeched, systems failing one by one. The ship trembled. Vecker raised his weapon, but Kale already knew before it even happened, that it wouldn't matter. Because for the first time since his capture, the child smiled. The ship groaned as if the very fabric of its structure were resisting reality itself. Klaxons blared, red emergency lights casting frantic shadows along the corridors. Kale barely registered the chaos unfolding around him. Technicians shouting into failing comms, soldiers scrambling for weapons that suddenly felt meaningless. His attention was locked onto the child, who now stood unshackled in the middle of the containment cell. The fracture in the observation glass had not spread, but it hadn't healed either. It simply remained, an unnatural, unmoving scar across reality. The air was thick, charged with something Kale could neither name nor measure. Vecker, weapon raised, moved with the controlled precision of a man trained to eliminate threats. But Kale knew the truth now. This was no ordinary threat. This was something else. Something fundamentally wrong with their understanding of the universe. The child lifted his hand. He didn't move quickly, didn't lash out or strike. He simply raised his fingers and pressed them lightly against the cracked glass. The entire ship lurched. Gravity buckled for a fraction of a second, pulling Kale's stomach into his ribs. Sparks exploded from control panels, screens flickered with unreadable static, and a deep groaning echoed from the ship's core, like the vessel itself was screaming. Vecker fired. The plasma bolt shot forward, a flash of red energy streaking toward its target. It never reached the child. The moment the bolt should have struck, it stopped, suspended mid-air. A perfect, frozen fragment of light and heat. It hovered there, crackling with energy, and then it unraveled. Not diffused, not deflected. It ceased to exist. Kale's breath caught in his throat. No technology, none could do that. Not even the most advanced Empire-class dampeners could erase matter so effortlessly. His mind raced for an explanation, but none came. The child turned toward Vecker, his expression unreadable. There was no anger, no fear, only an unsettling, quiet understanding. Vecker fired again. This time, the shot never even left the barrel. His weapon collapsed. One moment it was there, a sleek black instrument of war, and the next it was a handful of disassembled components, the pieces clattering uselessly to the floor. Because he wanted to be found. Vecker moved. A flash of steel, a last desperate attempt to reassert control. The blade arced toward the child's throat, and passed through nothing. One moment the child was there. The next he wasn't. Not vanished. Not teleported. Simply gone. As if he had never occupied that space to begin with. The blade clattered to the floor. Vecker stumbled back, breath ragged. His eyes darted around the room, searching for something, anything, that made sense. A whisper brushed through Kale's thoughts, softer now, calmer. They will come soon. His blood ran cold. The ship shook. This time it was not from the child. The deck plates trembled beneath their feet, the unmistakable reverberation of something massive emerging from hyperspace. The emergency monitors flickered back to life, their screens filled with interference. But through the static, Kale caught a glimpse of them. Not ships. Not in the way the Empire understood them. Beings. Dark, shifting silhouettes that drifted into real space without propulsion, without engines. Their forms were fluid, shifting between shapes that his mind could barely process. And they were waiting. For him. For the child. For whatever came next. Vecker turned toward Kale, his face pale beneath his visor. What the hell did we just bring aboard? Kale forced himself to meet his gaze. I don't think we captured him, he murmured. I think we just opened the door. The ship was dying. The structure groaned as something vast loomed just beyond the veil of normal space. The emergency lights flickered, struggling to cast any semblance of stability in the chaos. Kale barely registered the panicked voices shouting orders that no longer mattered. The monitors were useless. displaying nothing but shifting static and fragmented readings. The hull itself trembled beneath their feet. Not from weapons fire, not from an external force, but from something deeper. Something that should never have been allowed inside. Vecker stood rigid, staring at the void beyond the observation window. His hands twitched at his sides, hovering near weapons that would do nothing. He was a soldier trained for every scenario except this. His jaw clenched so tightly Cale thought he might break his own teeth. Cale understood. He, too, had spent his life trying to categorize the unknown, reduce it to data and controlled variables. But there was no framework for what stood before them. No precedent. No logic. Only the unbearable certainty that the rules they had once relied upon were unraveling. The child was gone. Not vanished, not fled. Gone. And in his place they had come. Shapes without form. Mass without substance. Silhouettes that shifted between angles that didn't exist, pressing at the edges of comprehension. Their presence was not a physical intrusion. It was a knowing. A creeping, insidious awareness that they saw everything. Cale gasped as something brushed against his thoughts. Not a voice. Not words. But a presence, vast and unfathomable. It coiled around his consciousness, peeling back layers of self like brittle paper. His knees buckled. His vision blurred. He wasn't sure if he was still breathing. You were never meant to keep him. Atoms stretch, his thoughts smear into the space between moments. Then, all at once, stillness. The ship drifted. The alarms were silent. No flashing lights. No groaning metal. No voices. Cale forced his breathing into something controlled. Around him, the bridge crew stirred, their faces pale and hollow. Vecker was hunched over the console, shoulders rising and falling with uneven breaths. "We're alive," someone whispered. Cale wasn't sure if that was true. He turned toward the viewport. The void stretched endless before them. No stars, no galaxies, just black. A heavy weight pressed against his mind. He knew then that they had not escaped. Not truly. The Empire had stolen something they could never hope to contain. And now something far greater had noticed them. And it was watching.